Okay, thank you everybody for coming back for this final session. I'm not going to recap on the sessions before, other than to say we've had a really interesting day so far, looking at different aspects of personalisation, from the art works that were presented this morning, and then that amazing discussion about personalisation in different practice in different sectors. So we're going to move on from that now to look forward and take that forward into the future. So I'm going to stand so I'm not in front of you. Sorry. So this session, any questions, any answers? I don't know. Any questions? Question time. But it's question time without having to throw bricks at the television type session, I hope. And it's going to be introduced and facilitated by Timandra Harkness. And I'm going to say what I have written, I think, about Timandra, which is that she's a presenter, writer, and apparently a lapsed comedian, but we might be the judge of that later on. She wrote Big Data, Does Size Matter?, which was published in 2016, and talks I've seen online on the personalised century. She's also a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society and a member of their Data Ethics and Governance section. So I think she's in a great place to facilitate this discussion. So over to you, Timandra.
Thank you very much. Yes, I arrived quite coincidentally, proudly sporting my outlier badge from the Royal Statistical Society. And I have to say you should all go and join, because if you're interested enough in data and personalisation to be here, you should totally join. So that's my bit done, so I don't get told off. It's great for me to be here. I'm going to give you a personal warning, which is that I'm currently writing another book, and it's about personalisation. So if any of you say anything remotely interesting, I'm going to write it down and steal it and put it in my next book. So please make sure you say your name so I can at least credit you. With that stated up front, the way this is going to work, we have a great panel from really varied perspectives. I shall introduce them. We have questions on cards, probably more than we will have time to get through. So apologies in advance if you wrote down a question and we don't get to it, but I'll try and get through as many as possible. Most of you have not put your names on, so I will read them out. And then if the panel want clarification or your answer, then you'll have to declare yourselves, or not. I mean, entirely, if you want to stay anonymous. After all, who are we to argue with that? Today of all days. Should I say we're like filming and recording, and if you've bunked off work, you should keep your mask on and disguise your voice? It's too late, anyway. On our panel, we have Paul Mason, who is a freelance journalist, writer, and filmmaker, focusing on social unrest and networked political behaviour. He advised the EU's Decode initiative, which saw Barcelona and Amsterdam attempt to become rebel cities. It would have to be them, wouldn't it, of all cities, against data extraction by tech monopolies. Reema Patel is an associate director at the Ada Lovelace Institute, and if you're not familiar with their work, you should be. They do great things around data, leading their public attitudes and public deliberation research and its broader engagement work on justice and equalities, particularly health and social inequalities. She has advised organisations including the Wellcome Trust and advising patient and understanding patient data on approaches to public engagement, particularly as they relate to understanding lived experience and impacts on underrepresented communities. Speaking of which, Natalie Banner leads Understanding Patient Data, an initiative hosted at the Wellcome Trust that aims to make the way health data is used more visible, understandable, and trustworthy for patients and the public. And you must be really, really busy at the moment, so thanks for making the time to come down. And finally, Rosa Curling is a lawyer with Foxglove, which is a non-profit organisation taking on government and tech giants to, quote, stand up for a future where technology is used to benefit everyone, not just the rich and powerful. So after this session, she and Paul will be leading a march to the barricades at the end of the road. Foxglove's recent cases include ensuring the disclosure of secret contracts between tech giants and the government, known as the NHS COVID-19 data deals. It's actually written in that voice. And forcing the government to extend the deadline for the GP data grab, which has probably ruined your holiday plans. Yeah. Good. So we have a great panel. I mean, what a great range of expertise and opinion and perspective. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out the questions. Panel, don't everybody feel obliged to answer every question, but I'm certainly not going to stop you if you want to pitch in. So if I haven't kind of given you the meaningful look, but you really want to dive in on a question, glare at me and dive in, basically. Okay, but I'm going to start with this one because I think this is a very broad, conceptual, high-level question, which in a way I think throws open a whole load of other questions. The question is over-personalisation killing personalisation? Yeah, exactly. It's that kind of question you go, actually, that's a huge question. Go for
I like
Rena.
it.
Go on.
Yeah, no, it's really, really provocative question. And I guess then the question is, what is personalisation? What is over-personalisation? And one of the things I'm really interested in is who gets to say how information about them is gathered, used, and kind of constructs the sort of digital self. So in that sense, personalisation would be your right to kind of articulate who you are, how you're represented in all these different places, and maybe in the health context, that would be, you have a right to sort of say, here's this kind of health data, you can have that about me, only these people can have that about me, and they can use it for this context and those purposes. And by the way, that reflects who I am. Over-personalisation might well be, and I'm just riffing here a bit, but over-personalisation might be the idea that some organisations out there are just able to kind of gather lots and lots and lots of information about you, and you have literally no idea that's happening. You don't know how that's happening, or the context and the environments in which that's happening. But there's something that we're really interested in. We wrote a report called The Data We'll See Now, in which we've identified lots of different ways in which lots and lots of health data is being gathered about us in all sorts of contexts without us being aware about that. And the next step question is, we don't often know what's happening with that. So, you think about the Fitbits, various wearables and trackers, et cetera. It does feel like there's like a new frontier, which is this frontier over-personalisation, some might say. Of course, there might be opportunities to use some of that information really well if kind of governed properly, but there's really interesting, power asymmetry that comes from this question, which is who gets the kind of ability to make those decisions, and who actually, as a data subject or a data beneficiary, you don't really know in some instances what's being collected and used about you. So I like that question a lot.
It's a good question. Natalie, what do you think on this? I mean, is this a useful way to get into how personalisation can benefit individuals, and how it can, I guess maybe my question is, does the datafication of personalisation somehow get in the way of making things personal in a way we might think of in other contexts?
The datafication of personalisation. This is going to become a tongue twister, isn't it, eventually? I mean, actually, that question just reminded me of the discussion in the previous panel and Deborah's points about granularity. And actually, if you're thinking in a health context, statistically, to be able to find something out about yourself, if you have a condition or a disease, you necessarily need to be more than an N of 1. If you go too granular and too specific, then you're essentially an island, and you have no idea in what relation you might have to others, whether there are others like you, relevantly similar to you. So if you go too far down the personalisation route, I think, and I think it'd be really interesting to sort of discuss more where that line might be. In a health context, you might then just cease to be able to know anything about predictively whether you might respond to this treatment or that treatment, whether there are other people who are relevantly similar to you. So there is always got to be a balance of finding enough similar people, relevantly similar people, to be able to tell, is this treatment going to work for you? Is your condition something that we can draw on previous data from other individuals to predict or know something about what your trajectory is likely to be? So I think you can run the risk of going too far down that line. But what is that line, and what is the point at which there are enough other people relevantly like you, but of course you are going to be an individual who has unique experience, unique background experience, unique characteristics. So there is a line there. I'm not sure if in the health context it's statistically possible to say this is exactly where that line is, and of course it's going to be different for different people. But when it comes to how people feel about that level of personalization, the thing I always refer to is the ladder of creepiness, right? So everyone is going to have a different level of sensitivity to feeling that, to their reactions to something being targeted at them, right? Some people would say, great, that pair of shoes follows me around the internet. That's really helpful. It reminds me that I might want to purchase that. Other people would find that invasive and creepy. And so that notion of there being very different levels at which people will find a degree of personalization like too much, too creepy, too invasive, is going to vary between different people. Of course, how on earth do you then devise products, services, tools, and so on that will sufficiently allow people to have treatments and services provided for them that are going to have an element of personalization without going too far up that ladder is a huge challenge. And I certainly don't think in healthcare we've figured out at all how to get that balance right yet.
Paul, does this come down to a level of autonomy that you get to choose? You get some control over who gets to climb how far up your personal creepiness ladder, or is this something that you do need to actually step back and address at a societal level? What do you think?
Well, the way I look at personalisation is corporate and state power focused on an individual human being. I can't see it in any other way. No one else has the power to personalise, apart from corporations and states. But I'd never heard the idea of over-personalisation before, but it immediately triggered a thought about a parallel with a concept in sociology called over-determination. So Louis Althusser, the Marxist, Marxists believe that being determines consciousness, that the social determines the individual. The material determines the ideological. But Althusser in the 70s brought in this idea that it's not simply a single one-way process, but it can be many competing one-way processes. And the model one has in one's mind as when you talk about over-determination is a single 24/7 reality into which several forces are trying to cram their desired outcome. And when Althusser came up with this idea of over-determination, it was a way of explaining chaotic outcomes. And I think that, if you want to look for my sort of answer, I immediately, when you said n greater than 1, I thought, what this can produce is n less than 1. It can produce an individual who has no autonomy. Because on my timelines, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, there is competition for that space where the ad comes up. So you want a pair of headphones. The headphones appear in Instagram and then they appear in Twitter, and it's mesmerizing you. But what's interesting is that it can be anything from like an earbud to a sort of £50,000 car. And that's where the weirdness is. The competition for your eyeball and for your attention is it's chaotic because everyone is trying to force themselves into that space.
How does this relate to Foxglove's work on, if you like, trying to protect? I don't know, maybe I'm misinterpreting what you do, but my sense is that you are, in a sense, trying to protect the rights of individuals against companies and the state from this kind of over-control of our environment and our world. How does over-personalisation fit into that? Do you see it in a similar way that a bit of targeting is fine and it's helpful to us, but trying to put us in a niche of one removes all our capacity as an individual for self-control? Or is there a more sophisticated way of looking at the question?
First of all, I really want you to come and read out our entire website, please, in your voice, because I feel like it would add so many, it'd be so much more interesting. It's completely brilliant. Anyway, sorry, we'll talk about that after with your hourly rate. But I think I probably do say in some ways similar to Paul. So Foxglove, we set up because we felt like power had fundamentally changed, and data space was a place where power was now located. And this had kind of happened without us really having a say in it, without us really even, well, talking personally, even really noticing it. I remember I did a case in my old job where I was challenging the kind of collection of data by UK government post-Snowden revelations, and it was about, you know, what our secret services were picking up that I was arguing was legally privileged and parliamentary privileged and journalistically privileged. And of course that was very important, and it was a great case to take, but next to the government were these 2 or 3 enormous companies who had created databases about us all, which made the Spooks database look like kids' play. And that had happened without any of us really we certainly haven't said yes to it. We don't really understand what they're doing with that data. They're certainly not transparent about it. I think you only need to look at the Wall Street Journal articles over the last few days where, you know, it's clear that companies are aware that harm is being created on their social media platforms and they're not responding to it. They're ignoring it. They're trying to squash it. They're trying to get human rights whitewashers, you know, to make sure it's all fine. And it felt like we needed to reassess how power was being exercised. And I guess what we're trying to do is investigate that, challenge it when it looks like it's actually creating harm or abuse. And I think we also really felt like we wanted to add a bit of friction to the space. It felt like there were lots of ethical boards and, you know, oversight boards of Facebook all internally done, and there was a lot of kind of panels and kind of, you know, internal analysis, and actually what there wasn't was a challenge to them, you know, for example, in the courts, or a kind of real public challenge to what they were doing and the power they were exercising. I thought it was very interesting, the answer. I was asking one of the gentlemen in the previous panel about this question about consent in relation to advertising targeting. And he absolutely recognises the entire system is broken, and yet there's no, I mean, he says, you know, but something needs to happen. Well, nothing is happening. The regulator that we have closed the complaint. I mean, there's a way in which there is so much concentration of power in a kind of small number of companies, and there's a kind of wild west, I think, in some ways. And I guess what we're trying to do is to expose that and challenge it where we can and where the kind of courts allow. And I think the courts is a good place for that friction to be played out and argued about.
Excellent. Well, I'm just doing a bit of reordering of questions on the hoof here, because I kind of want to flip this question around now, especially given the context of this programme, because I think there's a danger here that we spend a lot of time talking about all the potential downsides of personalisation and data gathering, and forget that in the health context in particular, it can be really beneficial. So another really apposite question, again with no name on. And I'm going to start with you this time, Natalie, and then let everybody else have their say. How will people think about, and I might also actually come out after the panel have had their say and see what thoughts you all have. How will people think about sharing their healthcare data for research in 10 years' time? I mean, obviously, if we knew that, we wouldn't need this research project in a sense, so I'm not expecting a definitive answer, but Natalie, you have been looking at this for some time. So what are your predictions?
Might depend on how successful Rosa is, to be honest. In 10 years' time, so I think we can overestimate what we can achieve in a few years and underestimate what we can achieve in a longer term. So I would definitely say 10 years is an interesting time horizon. I think that there is potential for us as a society to become much more cognizant of the way that information that's contained within health records can be used for phenomenally beneficial purposes that can help the health service, that can help advance research, that is going to save and improve lives. And I do think that for all of the negative publicity that there is around the use and sharing of health data, the way the narrative has shifted in the time that I've been working on it is that there is a much greater recognition that, of course, this data can be used for good things. 5 years ago, no one recognized that. They just thought it was all negative and all bad. There is a recognition that there is potential to use this sort of data for beneficial purposes, but nobody believes that it's actually going to be used in the way that's being claimed solely, that even if there are going to be great research uses and brilliant medical advances, what about all that other stuff that goes on behind closed doors that no one talks about, the private sector deals, the lack of transparency, and so on. So I think in 10 years' time, we will be much more cognizant of the fact that in order to get the healthcare that we receive, our data is necessarily being used to help provide those services and help improve those services. But I expect that there will be a higher degree of expectation around elements of choice and control that we have over that. And indeed, to have access to and use that information ourselves as part of our own healthcare, because that's something that hasn't really gained a lot of traction. There's a lot of talk about research uses, but actually as an individual, if I had better access to and management and control of the data about myself to help my own condition or the conditions of someone I care about, that actually could make quite a profound difference to how I interact with the health system, how I feel about managing my own condition. But the idea of patients having access to their own data is sort of one of those things that there's been commitments to for years, but still hasn't really translated into a different kind of relationship that you have with the health profession, mediated through the data about yourself, about your condition, and so on. So I suspect in 10 years' time, we're going to, and I hope, broadly speaking, because I'm acutely aware that there are massive issues of digital exclusion, of some people having great access to things, smartphone apps and so on, and others emphatically not. But I would expect we'd be in a position where we are more cognizant of the way that data about us is being collected and used. We're using it more ourselves to help manage our conditions. And I would hope there has been a shift towards a greater degree of transparency, accountability, societal involvement in the decisions around data. And then we will get the benefits without all of the downsides and all of the negative things, that the sorts of things that Rosa's trying to fight against. So that's my hope. I suspect it might go the other way.
Well, I must say,
the way that we're going right now.
If a pandemic and a lot of really fast research about how to stop the pandemic killing us, if that hasn't shifted our degree of enthusiasm for sharing our data, then it kind of throws the question, what else will it take?
Well, it would take not doing all the dodgy stuff as well.
I hope someone's writing this down to submit to all the official inquiries.
But it's not just
Stop
about
doing the dodgy
But
stuff.
it's not just about the use of the data, it's all the other stuff. So people's trust in use of data is going to be mediated by whether the company involved is paying their taxes, whether the government is doing things that are not exactly transparent when it comes to procurement. So it's not just about the use of the data, it's the whole environment around it that I think has been particularly problematic. And the light that's been shone on those issues as a result of the pandemic has heightened our awareness of the benefits, but it's certainly thrown a spotlight on the risks as well. I'll stop there.
So, Rosa, since you've been name-checked, what is it you're going to do in the next 10 years so that we all feel that use of our healthcare data is trustworthy?
Oh, yikes, okay.
Just a small question.
So I think NHS data is actually a really fascinating space. It's fascinating because it's very unique, the NHS data. It's a kind of some of the most useful machine-readable data on the planet. And as a result, lots of tech companies are very keen to get access to it. But I also think it raises some really interesting questions about this idea of individual rights and group rights, because actually health data isn't just about individual rights. What's unique about NHS data is actually it's also there for the benefit of the public and the benefit of everybody. And I think one of the things that's slightly problematic about the way data and data rights are discussed is it does always focus from a legal perspective on the individual. And actually when it comes to health, it's a much more complicated kind of set of factors and decision-making processes, I think, that are going on. What Natalie's alluding to is that we've been involved in a case which is challenging the decision that was taken to basically pool and centralise everyone's GP data records from kind of cradle to grave, basically. And this was announced post the pandemic in a pretty silent way, and we challenged it, and as a result of that, they've delayed the whole thing. And I think it's raised a whole load of interesting questions that we should all be kind of reflecting on about health data, because I think the first question I think that needs to be asked is whether it does need to be centralised. Is there a case, has the case been made that actually all our health data should be in one huge mega database, which is then accessible to who? And then the question is, well, who has access to it? And if it isn't centralised, could it instead be, for example, a kind of federated data system? And one of the things that we're kind of exploring and looking at with people who know way more than we do, because we're a set of lawyers and campaigners, but the kind of experts of the world like Natalie and others, is this question of whether, for example, and just to reflect a little bit on your cities, you know, perhaps a different version, an alternative to the kind of centralised huge GP database, which, as you can imagine, would be very of interest to the Googles and the Amazons and the Instagrams and Facebooks and everyone else you can think of, is that there could be a way in which there is a federated kind of that data, health data is pooled locally, and then there is a genuinely kind of local participation process by which decisions are made about who has access to that data. Because I think what's really missing in so much of this technology and innovation is a kind of sense of democracy. Like as I was saying, it feels like so much has happened without any of us really realising it or indeed consenting to it. And actually what's needed is, particularly when it comes to health data, because as Natalie says, trust is basically the kind of, for me, seems to be the core of how the NHS system works. And if there is no longer a trust between the patient and the clinician, I can't see how a proper functioning health relationship can really function. And I think people will only talk to their doctors if they know exactly what's going to happen to that information and how it's going to be used. And I think one idea that would be worth exploring is this question of whether, for example, you could have local groups or a kind of panel who makes decisions that local people are involved in, that patients are involved in, that researchers are involved in, that medical practitioners are involved in, where there is a discussion about, for example, if, maybe to use a slightly emotive example, if a company like Palantir, who is most well known for being a kind of major kind of customers are the CIA, the ICE Immigration Customs Enforcement in the US, which has done some delightful things on the US-Mexico border in relation to separation of children. Is Palantir a company that we want to have access to our health data? At the moment, they are managing the COVID-19 data store that you mentioned at the beginning. So I think there are some interesting questions there about consent and granular consent and making sure that we are all involved in what happens to our data, and not just as individuals, but actually as communities. I'll stop talking now, sorry.
So, Paul, communities, individuals, this sounds right up your street. What will it take for all of us in this room and outside this room to feel happy in 10 years' time that our health data can be in some way shared, donated, put to use by researchers for the general benefit?
I think the first thing I would say is that when we say our health data, we're thinking about clinical facts recorded about us by the NHS and GPs and others. But I think that there are three triangulation points. There's what's on my watch, how I did in my morning run, and that's everything else like that. And you could include that every temperature check done going to the hairdressers, which we do now. It takes my photo, it measures my temperature every time I go anywhere. So that kind of privately produced data. Then there's the NHS data, which, as you say, is machine readable and brilliant. And then there is what the tech companies are gathering without our consent, or with our consent under GDPR, is the behavioural data. Who am I? How many pints of beer do I drink a week? What is my time for running 5K? And all of that. And you can basically, I think, it might not matter what we give of our clinical data, because there's probably out there a Laplacian data universe whereby, you know, if you know Laplace said, if you know the position of something and the forces acting on it, you can predict everything in the future. And I think that there is a version of that which says, if you know that Paul Mason's DNA contains the following, 4% Neanderthal man and all the rest of it, you've got some facts about him, like his times for 5K, and he's still alive, age 61, you might not need his GP records to be able to impute certain futures for him. And especially the more you know about the circumstance. Did you grow up in the 60s? Was there lead in the petrol in the 60s? All the rest of it. Right. So the first thing is that. The second thing is, what's going to make us trust more? It's a very social thing. Thinking about this discussion, what's occurred to me is that there's no commonly held theory of data justice. That question of should Palantir have access is not answerable according to a spine of commonly held beliefs about justice. Unlike, for example, in, say, children's law or family law, we have a commonly a common culture of what is just. Now, I think what will happen is, first of all, the one thing I would do if I wanted to unleash the benign effects of the data aggregation is to rule out any future move. It would almost have to be written into a constitution of the United Kingdom, and certainly of the NHS, of any form of social insurance system. Because what people fear is that, because it was thrown around, wasn't it, 15 years ago, maybe the NHS should move towards social insurance. And maybe, you know, in another world it might have to, because it's not got enough money and we're aging. But look, the moment people understand that you look at my DNA, you triangulate it with my healthcare records and what's on my Fitbit or whatever, and then the life insurer or the health insurer takes no risk whatsoever. You, the individual, burden all the risk. If we had a completely freely provided, all the providers were public and had signed up to a theory of data justice, people wouldn't be worried. But when Dominic Cummings turns up at the Parliament and says, what I want is a dictator who can break all the rules, and if you think there's a possibility that at some point in this guy's life he's going to end up back in number 10, maybe in conditions of climate crisis or whatever, I, under no circumstances, will give consent under this GPDPR and iGuard, which is a whole other thing. I will under no circumstances give consent for my data to go into that data pool, because it will in future be used to burden me with all the risks of health insurance if the NHS collapses under the weight of the social pressures it's under. So that's, I mean, one other thing I just want to throw in, because the work you did, was very useful to me as a journalist writing about this. You then look at the current situation. You look at the safeguards, and yeah, they've got, under this GPDPR data scrape, there is. I asked myself as soon as I heard about it, what's the easiest point of failure? That's what you should always ask about everything. And then I discovered iGuard, and it said this is the committee that sits batting away requests from Palantir weekly. And if you read the minutes, it's like a medical ethics board, only hyper. And you're thinking, poor them, who are they? And then I read the kind of prospectus. It's experts in ethics, experts in health, experts in technology. No, it isn't. It's not. It's one professor sits on the board. The medical ethicist has an MA, good for him, but he's an MA in nursing medical ethics. There's a patient rep, good for her, but no, I want a philosopher. I want military grade technology people. And here's the other thing. 3 out of the 7 have links to the MOD. Why? How did that happen? Did anybody ask? No. And so only as soon as you interrogate what was the easiest point of failure, it looked very weak. And so no, I'm not going to give any of my data for the moment.
Okay, so until the whole of the power relations of the UK changed, Paul's not giving them up. So Remo, because I know Ada Lovelace tries to take a very balanced approach and bring in different points of view. How do you see this going? In 10 years' time, if we took a poll of people in the UK, where do you think they would stand?
I think it's not very determined. I think it's really open for us to shape. That's the first thing I'd say. I mean, your question about in 10 years' time, really the kind of question is how do we reverse or shift this pattern, which we seem to have got into, which is, use access, sharing of data, and then you hit a point which is care.data, tenuous climate of trust, and then some not particularly structural quick fixes are added, and then you go back up that loop. So GDPR is just the latest in a range of sort of techlash moments, followed by the attempt to quickly fix the lack of public confidence in the sharing of data. And I think we've been around this loop twice now. So my suggestion is now we're on the second round, that we try to understand what went wrong both times, and we try to understand, what it is that people want to fix before we can feel confident in this use and the access of data. So one of the things that we've been doing, we work really closely with understanding patient data on some citizens and juries around health data partnerships and commercialisation. And people were really, really keen to make sure and articulate that they wanted strong safeguards around third-party access to patient data. So I think that was just something that just comes up time and time again around private sector access to health data. And it's come up again in the guise of a pandemic another time. We also ran some citizen juries specifically on GDPR during the week of the announcement of the GDPR and the techlash. And in that, again, people hadn't changed their views during the pandemic. They recognised enormous potential for the use of this data, but they were extremely concerned about insidious uses that they weren't informed about or they didn't know about, and really want to see the sector tightened up in terms of transparency. What data deals are being done, where are they being done? We don't really know that. It's quite opaque still. We don't really know, what third-party organisations are really doing with that data. So I think there's a lot to sort out before we can sort of say, here's the potential beneficial use of that data. And it's not easy because at the same time, medical research charities need access to that data. They need to be able to, use it in the context of a pandemic. So it's actually quite complicated, I think. It's one of the reasons for it. You positioned us as taking a kind of, an impartial, independent view. I'm really proud of our independence. It's one of the reasons for why we want to take that role in the landscape, because it isn't easy.
In fact, I was thinking we might take a straw poll, but now we've started to unpack how complicated it is. I'm going to attempt to reproduce in real life the kind of clever sliders you get on data viz websites. All right, so imagine 10 years in the future, a range of possible futures. Over here, we have Paul's complete transformation of power relations in the UK and probably the Western world. Over here, we have status quo. Things are exactly as they are now. All the chaos, all the uncertainty, we're not sure who's responsible. And this is a continuum of possible futures, all right? So starting here, I'd like you to put your hands up if you feel comfortable letting your health data be shared with researchers for health research. So who would be comfortable? Okay, so we've got a few hands. Deborah Ashby, I would expect nothing else, since you'd be one of the people with access to it. I mean, it would look bad if you didn't vote. Okay, so status quo, we've got a few. Come put your hands up so we can see them. That's it, good. So about half a dozen. Okay, so now moving over. So now we're like a quarter of the way towards this more answerable, controllable, democratic. Who would be comfortable in this slightly 25% better future? I'm interested in the people who are now putting their hands down. It's like, you prefer the status quo. Okay, good. I was expecting Okay, so now we're halfway to this complete. So let's say we have some transparent control, there is private access, but it's relatively controlled, but maybe like still 50% dodgy, to quote the expert. Who would be comfortable in this kind of circumstance? Most of your health data being shared. There's still some reluctance. Okay, 3/4 of the way towards Paul's Althusserian utopia. So you can't just put your hands down because you're tired, all right? And what about if we're all the way to Paul's Althusserian utopia? Okay, so I think we've answered that. Althusserian, is it? I know that's wrong. I know it's not an Althusserian utopia. But, you know, you can ask him in the bar afterwards to spell out his 12-point program. Okay, so, well, I think this has given us an idea that basically the more transparent and the more equal power relations are, the more comfortable we are giving our data away. Shock finding. Who'd have thought? Paul, before we go on to the next question, I know everyone else in the room is burning to know this almost as much as you're burning to tell us. What is your time for a 5K?
Too long.
Come on, I not only could not run 5K, I have a watch that just tells me the date and the time. I mean, I feel both square and really unfit now.
It's my heart that I'm monitoring because I've got heart disease. So don't tell my insurer. But no, it's the beats per minute, and thanks to beta blockers, they're low.
Okay, good. So your life as a Northern Soul star is
over.
Don't say that. Okay, well, I think the next question, in fact, leads quite well on from where that discussion went. And also, because of what you were saying, Paul, I'm going to start with you on this one, but I will come back to everybody else. What are your thoughts on using big data to identify risk in individuals, e.g., cancer risk, risk of admission, and sharing that risk with the individual?
That's interesting, isn't it? Because the ethical way that presents itself to many people is when they do a DNA test and they're asked, do they want to know if they have propensity to Alzheimer's disease or forms of dementia? Because it's immediately, so you're not even using big data, you're simply using the DNA, but you know, I would presume you can aggregate the DNA data and find actually patterns against, you know, gender, age, etc., age of onset. So I think here's where I would come to, like, I think there are, to talk a little bit about what we did in this Barcelona thing. I mean, I sat there in Barcelona and had lunch and advised them. But what they did was the mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, who was from this leftist party, decided, and Barcelona, what is even now the world centre of the mobile phone industry, has a biennial mobile phone jamboree. And she walked in and said, hold on a minute, we've just sold the entire future data of the smart city of Barcelona to Cisco Systems in exchange for a bunch of wires and tin boxes. That's off. You can sell us the wires and tin boxes, but the city will own its data. And from that, they said, well, all right, good. And you know, Barcelona at the time was full of rioters. And they said, good, and occupying spaces. But how can the city own its data? Who wants the data? Who wants the city council, which can be taken over by the Conservatives next year, to be owning the data that we produce in the smart city? You know, this is everything. The proverbial, you know, temperature check as you go into the tube. What you get in Singapore and Chinese cities. Everything from that, you know, to your journey times and eventually, what does your smart automobile see? The data your car collects. So they say, we're not selling it, we're owning it, but in what form can we own it? And what they decided to try was to use blockchain. And to use blockchain, which, as you know, blockchain is a way of having a non-centralized contract in which every iteration of the contract contains everybody else's in the world's contract. So that's blockchain. And the experiment is, can we come up with ways of citizens expressing their citizenship through giving revocable permission and actually detailed revocable permission for the use of their data. And so that is kind of my answer to the question. That would be my answer to everything, including this question of, all right, because I will then be able to go. I'll have a little dashboard, maybe on my cell phone, and it barely works in Barcelona, by the way. It's just experimental. EU funded it and then stopped funding it. But I have an interface that says, right, in general, my attitude to my data privacy is as follows: no third-party use for profit at all. And then to the question you asked, but I want to know everything. I want maximum input. You could choose the other. You could say, I don't want to know if I'm going to die at the age of 37 and a half from a horrible disease. So it's revocable permission, not on a centralized registry, but on a decentralized registry, would be my preference for solving all of those ethical problems.
Wow, there you go. And extra marks for bringing blockchain in for the first time in this event.
Oh, well.
If anyone doesn't understand it, you
Ching.
can see Paul afterwards. So, what are your thoughts on using big data to identify risk to individuals, and should they be told?
It's really interesting you've asked that, because the citizen juries I mentioned, we also covered risk scoring. So I'm happy to talk briefly about that. Just to flag that we've used it a lot during the pandemic in order to think about resource allocation. So a lot of people may or may not have heard about the Q-COVID algorithm, the shielded patient list. That requires identifying people who might be of higher risk and then targeting resources, or thinking about, how you might prioritize who gets vaccines in what order, who will get boosters in what order. So number one, we have used it across the UK as an approach to respond to the pandemic. Citizen jury is really interesting, discussed vaccine passports, risk scoring, GPDPR, and of those 3 case studies, they found risk scoring in the context of emergency response the least controversial. Again, though, they had some concerns. And actually, most of the concerns come back to this point of, what are the kind of acceptable applications and defining that, and when will there be a great risk of using risk scores for purposes that are really disempowering, disadvantaged people, they don't get any say. That example that Paul mentioned of, you may as a person not know that you've been profiled as likely to die at the age of 37, but an insurance company might know that based on the information that they've been able to gather about you. And I remember having a conversation and attending a workshop with the Association of British Insurers about 3.5 years ago, where they'd written and they'd spoken about the fact that their insurance organisations had adopted a voluntary moratorium on the use of some data, genomic data, I think it was, for the purposes of risk scoring. So we have a precedent, which is that industry organisations, insurance organisations in some sectors have chosen not to use some sorts of data for commercial purposes. And of course, there's a sort of more international conversation, which is a lot of governments are thinking about what the kind of appropriate and acceptable applications of risk scoring might be and what the other applications might not be. Also, Paul mentioned digital twinning. Well, you didn't call it digital twinning, but that's kind of what it's technically called, the idea that you sort of have these data points. And what kind of linking it back to that first question, over-personalisation, under-personalisation, what happens if some people have more information about them out there and other people have way less and other people are just off the radar? How do you risk score? It's a relative process, really difficult to do that accurately unless you have the same amount of information about everyone. So I think there's a lot to work through, basically.
So it's another case where it's actually really hard to separate individual data and uses from aggregated data and uses. Can I bring you in on this, Natalie? I mean, especially because of the particular medical thing which the question has raised.
Sure. I think one thing to note that for all the richness of clinical data that we might have in the NHS, it is messy. It's full of holes, it's full of inaccuracies, there are things that we don't quite understand in this data. So there is a world of difference between taking a sort of big data approach and looking across multiple variables and observing some features or some patterns in that data, where you can maybe describe that data and describe some connections or correlations in that data, to going from that sort of observational analysis to and descriptive analysis of patterns in that data to making a causal inference about that data and that there's a relation to then predicting something as a result of that data. And I think that you have to be incredibly careful about the sort of the chain that you might go from being able to see a pattern to then saying, oh, and therefore I can predict on the basis of this data that this is a likely probability of X, Y, Z. And I think sometimes when talking about these sort of big data, algorithmic analysis and so on, you can kind of miss the fact there is a huge difference between describing a pattern and being able to make a prediction as a result of it. And very often, I think with the data that we have in clinical context, and I don't know about the kind of quality and the accuracy and validity of data that's collected in sort of apps and wearables and so on, but certainly in the sort of routinely collected health data context, you'd have to be incredibly careful about making any predictions on the basis of that, because there are holes, we don't necessarily know what's missing from that data and so on. The other point is about actionability. In the genetic space, there is often a real trade-off about whether you actually undertake a test to inform you about whether you might have a particular genetic risk, depending on whether there's anything you can do about it. And that might be because there isn't necessarily a treatment that's been devised for that condition. It could just be a resource limitation question. So is there a point at which you say, well, I'm not going to explore the potential of a risk of a certain condition because there's nothing I could do about it if I did get that output? So it's not just a question of sort of the descriptive and the kind of quantitative aspects of the risk, but also the context in which you're going to be able to act or not act on that risk that has to be taken into account when thinking about whether there's that approach to risk scoring might be relevant. So that context of whether you can do anything as a result of coming up with a risk score, I think, has to be taken into account as well.
I'd like to can I broaden this out slightly? Because when I always see this phrase risk or at risk, my antennae go up because of the non-medical context in which it's used. And in fact, I think in the last session we were slightly alluding to it, the way that at-risk scores might be allocated to young people at risk of going into crime or bad educational outcomes. I'm probably especially sensitive because of the postcode where I live in southeast London. I mean, if they ever bring in predictive algorithms for policing, then I'm getting banged up just on the basis of my postcode, basically. But I'm always quite sensitive about that. It's like, well, is it right to use aggregated data about everybody to make predictions about individuals? When is that useful? When is it an infringement of somebody's rights? So I just thought you might have slightly broader thoughts on this than only the medical ones.
Yeah, so we've seen two cases that we've been involved with. One has been to do with a Home Office algorithm, which was in existence for many, many years without anyone knowing about it. And then there was just one little comment in an FT article which talked about a secret Home Office algorithm, which then led us to kind of ask some questions and get some disclosure through a legal process. And it turned out that there was an algorithm in place in relation to visa applications. So these are decisions about whether someone gets to come to the UK and study or gets to be able to marry the person they want to marry who's abroad or wherever it may be. And they were using basically a kind of like a predictive algorithm, which was basically had a series of criteria, a series of information was fed into the algorithm. Certain kind of weight was given to the factors, and out of the algorithm spewed a rating for each individual. You were either amber, red, or green. And if you were green, then you were considered a non-risky applicant, and you were basically a very kind of minor kind of scrutinization of your application process happened, and then you were given the visa. If you were red, it was the opposite. You were seen as a very risky applicant, likely to kind of, abscond or whatever, kind of violate your immigration control rules. And then there would be a series of kind of really thorough scrutiny of your application that would then happen. And so we challenged it, and it turned out through the disclosure process that nationality was one of the key bases on which they made the decision of whether you were risky or not. So if you happened to be born in a country that they considered to be risky and was on a table which was never disclosed, but there's literally a list of risky nations, then you, irrespective of your own personal circumstances, were put into the red rating. And there'd been a case which had happened that went all the way to the House of Lords, as it then was, that was looking at border control in Prague airport, where what would happen is the Home Office kind of representative in Prague airport, if they decided the person coming through the airport was likely to be of Romani or Gypsy descent, then they were going to basically be pulled over and be asked an additional series of questions. And they would be given, in essence, extra scrutiny in relation to whether they were allowed to get on the plane or not. And I think this is a nice example of how none of these issues are new. These are all exactly the same issues. They're just been digitalized and somehow seen as innovative and technology doing wonderful things and being efficient and effective and, you know, optimizing and making better the Home Office decisions. Actually, this algorithm was just doing exactly the same thing. It was being a racist decision-making process through a computer, which based on your nationality, you were either being determined as risky or not risky. And the scrutiny that was given to you as a result of your nationality was different depending on that. So in the end, they withdrew the algorithm after it was clearly breaches the Equality Act, and they recognized that and went away and rethought. But I think it shows that all of these kind of decision-making processes, these, which I guess in some ways you could call personalization processes of a sort, that actually there's something which is actually not very new about any of this at all. And it's actually just kind of, it might be a new piece of machinery that's making these decisions, but actually what's happening is the kind of power structures that Paul has alluded to are exercising their powers in ways that we've seen many, many, many times that tends to and harms the most vulnerable members of our community. So, sorry, I'm gone off on a tangent now.
I absolutely hoped you would. I was just thinking it's just like a very high-tech version of, was it Pontins that made the list of surnames they wouldn't take bookings from? All of it's just happened to be Irish traveller surnames. I don't know, if that had been like Nigerian surnames, wouldn't somebody have at the very least got sacked and possibly ended up in court? But no, it's like, oh, that looks a bit bad, don't do that again. Don't be a traveller or a gypsy, I think is the lesson we're taking away from today. So, okay, now here we've got something more positive. And what we've got here is actually two questions, but I think they're kind of a general and a specific version. So what I'm going to do is I'll ask you all both of them, and feel free to go as general or specific as you like. And I'll probably start with you, Rima. The general one is, what are your thoughts on using personalisation as a tool for social integration? So put your rosy viewpoint on. And the more specific one is, how is digital personalisation happening within the disabled communities that don't utilise so many products focused on visual and spoken information? It's quite interesting. So slightly wider thought about technology.
Can you repeat that second one? Sorry, I'm not quite sure.
How is digital personalisation happening within disabled communities that don't utilise so much the products focused on visual and spoken information? Do you want to ask for clarification? Whose question was this?
I think it would be really great if somebody could clarify, but otherwise I'll just make an effort.
Is the person who wrote this question in the room?
No worries, I'll just have a stab at answering it.
Have a stab at answering.
But if somebody wants to clarify that, I'd be really happy.
No, if they are
to.
here, they've got shy. Okay.
Okay. So the generalised question around
social integration.
Social integration. A really interesting question. I mean, actually linking it back to the conversation we were having about risk scoring, none of us mentioned, and probably had a bit more time, I would have mentioned social credit scoring, really, because overseas in particular, countries have been thinking about social credit scoring and building that into, and have been applying that and building that into the way they think about social media networks, for instance. So A good example of that is universal social credit scoring being used in China, and that's a really that's a challenging, there's a vision there of the risk that these tools and technologies are used not really for social integration, but rather social control and manipulation. So I think there's something to be quite concerned about on that front. In terms of social integration, bringing people together, there's all sorts of really interesting questions. One of the things we're doing is we're working on a project with the BBC around recommendation algorithms. So the BBC being an organisation that is deeply, focused on on public benefit and public good, and the fact that you've got iPlayer and some of the recommendation algorithms that might be used in iPlayer and sorting and so on. Just working with them to think through how to do that in ways that don't misprofile, misalign things, that actually think through the fact that people might want diverse content rather than, content just based on what they've previously done, that kind of thing. I think that's like a really interesting model that we're still in the early stages of scoping. We're doing some research interviews to try and understand what the issues are around that. But that's the sort of thing that I think where I do think that you've got these public bodies such as the NHS and the BBC, and there is the opportunity to build technological models that are more about bringing people together rather than atomizing them based on profiling what it is that they watched the last time they were on a particular TV show, for instance. And then on the bit about accessibility and disability, I think that's really important because there is a real risk that we assume that because we put a technological product out there, that everyone can access and use it in the same ways. And another research report that we did on the data divide demonstrated, actually 20% of the population don't even have a smartphone or access to a reliable internet. If they do, they end up using it in really different ways and having really different levels of kind of social capital around how to use technology. And then that's before you even get into the sort of questions about like whose health data is recorded accurately and why, and ethnicity and gender and so on. So, and I think that the disability question, the access question, is like an extension of the bigger question, which is just because we put a tech product out there by default does not mean that everyone is using it in the same way. So the next question is, how do we make sure that there's options out there for people who can't use the product, and how do we also design pathways that kind of allow people to not be disadvantaged because they're using it in a particular way. These are quite high level reflections, but hoping that they make sense in relation to the question. I'm sure other people want to say something as well on that.
Well, I think it is quite a high-level question because I guess it's kind of asking whether the recognition that people have not only different interests but also different needs and different strengths and weaknesses, if you like, could be a really positive use for personalisation, that you get your content not just personalised to what you enjoyed last time, but to the way that you find easiest to access material. Or to interact. If you prefer to interact by texting rather than by speaking on video, then it's possible to tailor your experiences to that. Yeah. So I assumed that was the kind of thing it was hinting at. Yeah. But Paul, do you have thoughts on? Well, turn your attention to the positive sides of technology. I mean, a few years ago, I remember talking to you about your book, in which basically we were going to overthrow capitalism without a revolution because digital reproduction of content was so cheap. So, can it also achieve social integration while we're at it?
Well, I still think that, but where I would like to push that question is into something that, just observing, I don't know how the rest of the day's gone, but just observing this discussion we've had, we find it really easy to think concretely about data sets and very difficult to think concretely about algorithms. And if you think about it in pure computing terms, that's because the data set always exists and documents itself, and will have had several iterations of what's in the database, no matter how complicated it is. But software, algorithms, are just machines, but they're the first machines in history for which there is no history. You can describe the evolution of this from the spinning jenny through to the most modern weaving machine today, but there is no history of any of the algorithmic technologies that are taking these decisions about us. Now, therefore, I don't know whether one of the following is true. The commercial incentive has incentivized the creation of algorithms that bring together communities of outrage. That seems to be really easy. So if you're really outraged, for example, about disability rights, you're likely to be drawn together. But it's not, for some reason, they don't easily bring together communities of difference and nuance. And that might be, I'm undecided, whether it could be simply, because we have no sight lines into the algorithms. Facebook will change its algorithm, or YouTube, in response to a complaint, but it will never publish what was there and then never tell you what the change is. So until we know that, we have no equivalent of the sort of, how did we get from 16 loom spinning machines to 128 loom spinning machines in 5 years? We just have no equivalent of it. So my hunch is that it is simply that that they're pursuing profit, and that the profit makes it easier to mobilize the hostility. But it could actually be, there could be a really philosophical Manichaean sort of explanation, and that is that for some reason digital technology prefers evil to good. I mean, that would be a really sort of high-level philosophical kind of answer, because I don't see digital technologies spontaneously creating what you might call these virtuous communities of people coming together to overcome difference, to integrate socially, as the question asked. So, I couldn't give a categorical answer to why that is.
Okay, that's still an open question. Do you have any clues? What could happen? What ways could we use personalising technology to bring people together, to include people, to make it easier? I mean, I realise you spend your professional life being usefully outraged, perhaps, and actually addressing the misuses and the bad sides. But does that give you a clue about, well, what could the good sides be?
Yeah, so we decided to call ourselves Foxglove because of the Digitalis, kind of the Latin name, but also because foxglove have both medicinal and poisonous effects. So we think that kind of technology and data, I think clearly it can do some good in the world, but it can also do some harm. And I think I have to admit, given that we're a directorship of 3 and 2 of us are lawyers, we find the criticising bit probably easier, but we are also desperately trying to think about, and I think in some ways, I talked a little bit at the beginning about this idea of friction. I think the hope is that if when you try and kind of expose what's happening and try and create a discussion about what's happening, what you're trying to do is create a space about alternative futures. And it feels like there is, I mean, again, kind of partly inspired by what Paul was doing in other cities, one of the things that Foxglove is trying to do is to, with local authorities and with mayors, I think while we have such an extraordinary kind of, no, let me try and be neutral, I'm a lawyer. While we have a significant majority in the House of Commons, it feels like resistance is quite hard there. Whereas actually mayors, for example, and indeed local authorities have concentrations of power that could create a very different future. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is think about how actually public bodies, locally or mayors, could use technology in a way that is genuinely beneficial to societies. And one of the things that we've been thinking through with them is this question, to go back to this question about GP data. And actually, like Paul has been describing, having a genuinely granular kind of consent process by which people choose how their data is used, how it's used collectively, how it's used individually, who has access to it, what on earth, the government always says, the data will only be used for public benefit. One of the IGARD requirements is it's for public benefit. I mean, how does this government define public benefit? I mean, I dread to think how they define that, but it's definitely not how I would define public benefit. And I think what we need is, I think there is space for a different way of using data and technology. And I think there's also this kind of way in which, well, if something is possible, then let's do it. Whereas actually, let's question whether we want to do something, whether we want that technology to be, and that innovation to happen. And actually, we can limit the way in which it's being used and limit what it's doing. And I think it's really important that we find and create these kind of, even if it's just local at this stage, kind of alternative futures that might be more beneficial.
I have this great image, just as you were saying that, people often talk about data pools or data lakes, and I think we were mentioning this before, it's not always a good phrase, but I'm now thinking, don't let's build a data Jurassic Park. Maybe that's the vision. We normally come to you for these medical things, but what about social integration? Because, as we all know, and it's become glaringly obvious again during COVID, you can't really separate the social from the medical. I mean, I did a program on life expectancy a couple of years ago, and one of the glaringly obvious things was you cannot separate medical aspects of life expectancy from social ones. So to turn that round on its head, could you use the idea of personalisation of data as a way of having more social integration, more inclusion, more accessibility? Is that something you've thought about?
Probably not in those terms, but I think that idea of, as you say, during the pandemic, there has been this you can see at the societal level, the kind of debates that we've been having around individual rights and societal expectations and duties and responsibilities. We all gave up an awful lot of our liberty for the sake of trying to sort of have a public health response to the pandemic. I don't know if there's been a period in history where there has been quite such a tangible example of the kind of the tensions that we're navigating around individual rights and social rights, and who's responsible for what, and where what duties we have to one another, what responsibilities and rights we have around our own individual sort of liberties, and I think that that certainly applies to data as well. So it feels as though we're at a moment in time where it might be possible to kind of have these slightly more tangible discussions where previously it's all felt very abstract, and conversations about data, the number of citizens' juries and engagement events we've done where people are just like, God, you say data and I'm just so bored, I don't really care. And then you get into it and you get into the substance of the discussion, and suddenly, wow, this is interesting, this is really challenging. And I think the pandemic has certainly thrown up a lot of these, as I say, it's made it much more tangible. So in relation to kind of health and social integration, I think we're probably at a point where it is a lot more possible to at least moot this idea of these alternative futures than it has been previously, because up till now it's all been very invisible, it's been very intangible, no one necessarily knows that this data about them is being used for these sorts of purposes, and now we're in an environment where it is possible to talk about this in a way that does resonate and does engage with people in a much more visible way. And actually, as I say, part of the role of understanding patient data is to make the use of data more visible. Well, the pandemic has certainly done that. We've also got to make it more understandable and trustworthy, but 1 out of 3 isn't bad for where we're at. So I don't know whether that we will get to this point of thinking more in terms of kind of integration. And I love the idea that actually the way that we're integrating is through outrage, because I just think that's so powerful, and it's true. We haven't got to the point where we can talk about communities of difference coming together. But health is one area where I think that may be more possible than other big societal questions about what's the kind of society we want to live in. Those things feel very big and intangible and fundamentally political. But health might be one of those areas where it's a bit more possible to have either consensus or a real appreciation and discussion of the diversity of views and opinions. And then the pandemic certainly crystallised that.
There are health's not political. You heard it here first.
Not political at all.
Okay. All right. Now look, we have about 10 minutes left. This is the point. I don't know about Question Time on TV. I've never done that. But if this was any questions on the radio, we would now go to the person that had the kind of little fun question that could have a really short, unimportant answer. But we haven't done that. But we do have a great question, which is actually huge and massive, and will kick us all out into the drinks reception going, oh, wow, man, and give us lots to talk about. But I'm going to be really mean to all four of you. As I say, we've now got 8 minutes. So if I could ask you all to answer this massive question in just under 2 minutes, that would be fantastic. Okay. It's even been posed very eloquently, and apologies if I misread any of the writing because there's a bit that goes off the edge. I feel personalisation is not only about what, but also about when, and having different spaces. What kind of consciousness will tech acceleration and the continuous prompts to express preference bring? So this is really, and this is totally, I'm definitely memorising everybody's answer to this to go in my book, because this is basically what my book is about, is how is this tech acceleration and the constant urging to express choices and preferences, how is that changing us? How is that changing our consciousness and the way we think? Would you like to start, Rima?
Sure.
Just a tiny question. You've got now about 1.5 minutes, but...
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible question. That is huge. I think the best way to do this in 2 minutes to hone in on one angle, which I think is this notion of performativity, which has come up in the academic literature. The idea that when you introduce something, you are using it to shape the way people behave. So I think that's really interesting as a concept. So when you've got this home office algorithm, you then use that to shape the way the home office are acting or behaving towards someone. But also you're using that to shape the way they feel, the same way with an A-level algorithm. And so there's this kind of like, you're trying to look at yourself in the mirror here with some of the data-driven technology. But it's not always you looking at yourself in a mirror. Other people are sort of kind of holding a mirror up to you. And it's not just a mirror. It's not like it reflects you back. It reflects that sort of digital twin of you back. And I think that's a really interesting way of sort of thinking about when is it that how far do you want to go with this stuff? Because it does have the risk of depriving people of their agency by sort of trying to be quite deterministic, back to that point, about who people are and how likely they are. So, when is a prediction really a prediction, and when have you kind of fixed or determined that person's future for them is the sort of question that I would throw back in the context of that really massive question. I've done my best to answer that.
I think it was a pretty good shot in 2 minutes. Okay, Paul, so this time it's not only us making history in circumstances not of our own choosing, but the technology making us.
Well, the earliest object we have made by human beings from imagination is the Stadel lion person or man, turned out could be a lioness, about 45,000 years old. And since then, up until about 20 years ago, the process of human creativity was we imagine things that don't exist and then bring them into being. So it is an amazing fact that the oldest thing that we have is not a human picture of a human, but a human picture of a half human, half lion mystical object. Now, I think that the challenge we have, network technology has changed us. It's made us into networked individuals. It's given us something, I've written about this, in an essay called Who the Fuck is Eleni Haifa, if you want to look it up. It's made us into people with multiple personalities rather than single ones. And it's done many things to our psychology, to our social psychology. But the biggest challenge is that it removes that process of imagining making. So that all you have is a set of, would you like a lion man this big or a lion woman? There are 128 potential choices, and you just have to choose. The ability to bring something completely new and not foreseen by systems is getting closed down because the system, and I won't go on, but if you just look at the way young people make electronic dance music, it's no longer, it's all montage, it's all choice of something already created, and they put it together, and it's very rarely like something like a drawing outside, a creation ex nihilo, from nothing. So I think that's one of the big dangers of the digital age, that we shut down our imagination.
Fantastic. I'm sure I'm taking you onto very much off your home turf here. So I'm going to prompt you by suggesting that one of the things that the digital world of endless choice from menus does to us is makes it very easy for us to stay comfortable on our home turf, and much more frightening to step off our home turf into unknown territory. So I'm inviting you to do this as a living experiment for the next minute. How is it changing us?
I was going to try and end with something that's a bit hopeful in response to this question, which is that I think in some ways what the personalisation, to think about it in terms of, for example, the advertising industry, gentleman who spoke earlier, I think it has exposed to us all, because the shoes do literally follow us around the internet, that there are things happening behind a kind of curtain of which we weren't aware. And it feels like to me, but maybe I'm being overly optimistic and Paul will tell me it's all doomed, but it feels like to me that the curtain is beginning to fall. It feels like the kind of, you know, the hip skateboarding chief execs of Facebook are no longer seen as this kind of neutral, progressive kind of company trying to do good in the world. I think it feels like the A-level algorithm kind of fiasco revealed that this is a policy decision which was absolutely harmful to bright kids in schools that had poor academic records. And the government didn't care until everyone got on the streets and shouted, "Fuck the algorithm," and then suddenly they cared, along with the fact probably that the head of Eton wrote and said, "We're not very happy about this algorithm prediction." But it did show that actually it does feel that that curtain has begun to fall away, and I think that is partly because we've become more aware of it, because perhaps that shoe that's following us has made us conscious that things are happening that we weren't really aware of, and we didn't really know how they were kind of being exercised. And it feels like there is a moment where we are now more aware of it, and the question is now what we do as a result of it.
Kind of, these boots were made for stalking you around the internet. I'm totally recording that as a Christmas hit. There you go. Natalie, I'm giving you the last word on this, and hoping that, don't feel you have to relate this back to the core subject of the day. I think it's a really high-level philosophical question. If you want to just walk away from all the health stuff and imagine how we are all being changed, how our souls are being altered by a constant diet of digital menus, go for it.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for that freedom. And actually, I suppose that freedom to imagine different possibilities and alternative futures and alternative possibilities is the very thing that feels like we may lose through the fact that we have this sort of constant barrage of what appears to be a sort of facsimile of consent options and choices and so on. So we are bombarded with this. Well, you have a choice here. You can choose whether you allow cookies to be collected on this site or so on. It gives us the illusion that there is an element of individual agency over that, but actually, as we've seen, pull behind the curtain, and perhaps that is not the case. I think Rose is right that there is a possibility of shifting that and changing that consciousness, that we are becoming a little more aware of the way that some of these power structures work, some of these incentive structures, the business models that are driving them. But I'd also caution that this is a very elite discussion, and actually this is not something that is going to be reflected necessarily in places outside of London and outside of this particular kind of venue in London. So I am conscious that while there may be this element of awareness and increasing cognizance of the fact that there are the business models and the incentive structures driving a lot of the use of data, the development of algorithms and so on, there's a whole world that is completely oblivious to this, and I'm scared by that. So I wish I could end on a hopeful note, but I actually think there's the way that our consciousness is changing for now seems to be heading down possibly a slightly bifurcated route where there's a group of people who are kind of aware of this and fighting it and active against it, but a whole lot of people for whom this is novel and scary and not something that they've ever really considered before. Partly because they don't really have the capacity or the interest or they've got other things to worry about, right? In terms of just living and getting on with their lives, especially in a kind of post-pandemic. I say post-pandemic. We're still in the pandemic context.
Late pandemic.
Late
well,
pandemic.
there you go. That's the next. This is the next challenge then for the Wellcome Trust. We need to get this show on the road, take it out to I don't know, maybe the comedy clubs of the rest of Britain, maybe the Saturday markets.
You'll have to relapse as a comedian.
Got to relapsed comedian. So on that note, I think I need to hand back over for a winding up. But can we just thank this fantastic panel, Rosa, Rima, Rosa and Paul.
Thanks very much, Timandra and everyone on the panel. That was extraordinary. It was a really good discussion. Thank you so much for that. And thanks for the questions, even those people who may not still be here who left their questions, and if they knew what the answers were, they would regret having left before they were answered. So just to wind up the day, don't worry, I'm not going to go on. I'm not going to give a speech about people like you and the project. I just first of all want to thank everyone who's done the presentations, the wonderful presentations of the art this morning and the discussions that have followed on from that and then this afternoon. All of you for coming, the people who've organised this, Yale and she's not here anymore because she's had to go out. She's pouring the drinks, hopefully. Anyway, and actually the venue have been really good. It's been really easy to be here. It's a great venue, and thank you for coming. We will be. There've been videos being done, photographs being taken. We will produce some kind of not 6-hour-long report of this, but a shortish video, we hope, and there'll be photos and everything will be available on our website. So hopefully from the three of us as investigators and all of the team that are here, thanks very much for coming, and please do join us for a drink.